The rain had been falling for 2 days, and the old house had started to smell of damp wood and desperation. Each drop hitting the tin roof was a tiny, cold hammer blow, and with each one 12-year-old Elara flinched. If you're captivated by this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel Philatundrw Stories for the next chapter. Your support brings these words to life. She was perched on the edge of her mother's bed, a bowl of lukewarm water balanced precariously on her knees. Her mother, Maya, was lost in a fever dream, her skin slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. Her murmurs were a tangled web of words Elara couldn't grasp, punctuated by sharp, ragged breaths. "It's okay, Mama," Elara whispered, her voice too small for the shadow-filled room. She wrung out the cloth for the 100th time, placing it on Maya's burning forehead. The silence that answered her was heavier than the rain. It was a silence that felt like an ending. This was the crisis. This was different. Panic, a cold and sharp-toothed thing, began to gnaw at the edges of Elara's resolve. The neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, was away. They had no phone. They were alone. Truly alone. Her eyes darted around the room, a frantic search for an answer it had offered 1,000 times before. None. Then her gaze landed on it. Tucked high on a shelf in the corner, almost invisible in the gloom, was the small metal lockbox. Her mother's most sacred rule echoed in her head. "Never ever open that, Elara. It's from a life that's over." Trembling, Elara stood. The box felt unnaturally heavy in her small hands. She looked at her mother's suffering face, at the way her chest struggled to rise and fall. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered. She didn't have the key. It didn't matter. She carried the box to the hearth, grabbed the rusty poker, and with a sob of effort she smashed the lock. The clang was violent in the quiet house. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, were ghosts. A photograph of her mother, young and laughing in the arms of a severe-looking man in a suit. A dried flower. And a single cream-colored business card, its edges yellowed with time. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she picked it up. There was no company logo, no address. Just a name etched in stark black letters. Alistair Croft. And below it a phone number. And on the back, in her mother's faded handwriting, 3 desperate words. "For emergencies only." This was an emergency. She ran from the house, the rain soaking her instantly, not stopping until she was pounding on Mrs. Gable's door, knowing it was empty but needing the shelter of the porch. The old rotary phone inside her own house hadn't worked in years. With fumbling, numb fingers, she dialed the number on the old woman's clunky cordless phone, her breath catching in sobs. It rang once. Twice. A voice answered. It was not warm. It was not friendly. It was the sound of polished ice and absolute authority. "State your business." Please," Elara stammered, her tears mixing with the rain on her face. "My mother, she's really sick. She can't breathe. I don't know what to do. Please help us." There was a long, dead silence on the other end. She could almost feel the man's cold calculations stretching across the miles. Then a click. The line went dead. Elara sank to the wet porch floor, despair washing over her. She had failed. But less than an hour later the sound came. Not of a single car, but of a thunderous, rhythmic beating that grew until it shook the very air. Elara looked up, wiping her eyes. Through the downpour she saw a black helicopter like a monstrous insect, descending upon their poor, forgotten street. Behind it, sleek black SUVs slid to a halt, their doors opening to disgorge men in dark uniforms. They had come. The man from the card had sent them. And as they moved toward her house with a terrifying, efficient purpose, Elara could only watch, wondering if her prayer had been answered, or if she had just unleashed something she could never control. The world became a blur of noise, light, and sterile efficiency. The men in dark uniforms didn't speak to Elara. They moved around her and her mother like a well-rehearsed tactical unit. Maya was carefully, almost reverently, lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into the helicopter. A woman with a severe bun and a kindish smile wrapped a blanket around Elara's shaking shoulders and guided her in after. The flight was a deafening, vibrating nightmare. Elara stared out the window as the only world she had ever known. The rusty roof of their house, Mrs. Gable's overgrown garden, shrunk to the size of a toy and was swallowed by the dark, rain-swept landscape. They were being taken away. Erased. They landed on the roof of a building so tall it seemed to pierce the clouds. The transition was jarring, from the roaring chaos of the storm to the hushed climate-controlled silence of what looked like a luxury hotel, but with the underlying scent of antiseptic. This was the Croft Medical Institute. It was all gleaming white floors, soft, indirect lighting, and a silence so profound Elara could hear the blood pounding in her own ears. They were placed in a private suite. It was beautiful in the way a museum diorama is beautiful. Perfect, cold, and lifeless. There were no personal touches, no cheerful get-well cards. Just a vast window showing a panoramic, godlike view of the city lights, a world away from their leaky roof. Doctors and nurses came and went, speaking in low, professional murmurs. They treated Elara with a detached politeness, offering her food she couldn't eat and juice that tasted like metal. Her mother, they said, was stable. She was receiving the best care possible. But the words felt empty. Elara sat curled in a massive leather armchair, feeling smaller and more invisible than ever. It was there in that silent, opulent room that he found her. The door opened without a sound. He didn't knock. He simply entered and the atmosphere in the room shifted, growing denser, colder. Alistair Croft. He was taller than she'd imagined and older than the man in the photograph. His suit was a dark, perfect shadow against the white room. His hair was silvered at the temples, and his face was a mask of carefully composed authority. But his eyes, the same shade of storm gray as her own, were what held her. They scanned the room, passed over her mother's still form in the bed with a flicker of something unreadable, and finally settled on her. Elara shrank deeper into the chair. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself. He walked to the foot of her mother's bed and stood, his hands clasped behind his back, a general surveying a battlefield. "Your mother," he said, his voice the same one from the phone, but now it had a physical presence filling the room. "The doctors inform me she will recover." Elara could only nod, her throat tight. "All expenses have been taken care of. You have nothing to worry about." The statement was meant to be reassuring, but it felt like a transaction. A bill had been paid, a problem was being managed. She was a problem being managed. He finally turned his full gaze on her, and it was like being scanned by a machine. "What is your name?" he asked, though the way he looked at her suggested he already knew. "Elara," she whispered. He gave a single slow nod. "Elara." He said her name as if testing the weight of it. There was no warmth in its utterance. He asked a few more clipped, practical questions. How long had her mother been ill? Had she seen a doctor recently? His interrogation was masked as concern, but it felt like an inquisition. He was gathering data. Every second in his presence confirmed her fear. This man was not a savior. He was a consequence. After a few more minutes of stifling silence, he turned and left as silently as he had arrived, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive cologne and a profound sense of dread. Alone again, Elara felt a new, desperate need. She needed to know who he was. The suite had a sleek tablet on a side table. Hesitantly she picked it up. It had no password. It connected instantly to the internet. Her fingers trembled as she typed his name into the search bar. Alistair Croft. The screen flooded with results. CEO of Croft Global. Philanthropist. Owner of half the city. The pictures showed him cutting ribbons, attending galas, a beautiful, cold-faced woman always at his elbow in those photos. He was a king in a castle of glass and steel. She scrolled, her heart sinking through the floor. It was all corporate news, polished and perfect. Until she found it. Tucked away in an archived article from 13 years ago. A society piece about a charity auction. There was a small, grainy photo. A younger Alistair, his hair darker, his smile less rigid, had his arm around a woman. She was looking up at him, laughing. The woman was her mother. The confirmation was a physical blow. This wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost from her mother's box, made flesh. And as she stared at the photo of her mother's radiant, forgotten face, a single terrifying question solidified in her mind. If he knew her mother then and he was her father, why did he look at them now as if they were a threat? The hospital suite, for all its luxury, had become a prison. Every time a nurse entered, Elara flinched, half expecting Alistair Croft to be behind them, his cold eyes taking inventory of their lives. Her mother slept on, trapped in a medically induced calm, oblivious to the storm her daughter was weathering alone. The photo of her mother, young and vibrant in Alistair's arms, was burned onto the back of Elara's eyelids. It was proof of a life, A love that felt impossible when contrasted with the man who had stood at the foot of the bed. That man hadn't looked at her mother with love, he'd looked at her like a ledger entry. A liability. He had to know more. The sterile, controlled environment of the hospital offered no answers. The answers were in the ghosts of their old house. The next morning, after a sleepless night, she saw her chance. A different, younger nurse was on duty, one who smiled more readily. I need to get some of my mother's things from our house, Elara said, her voice small and deliberately shaky. Her favorite shawl. It would comfort her. It wasn't entirely a lie. The nurse's face softened. Of course, sweetheart. I'll have one of the security drivers take you. Just be quick. The ride back to her neighborhood was a journey into a past that already felt distant. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean, but their house looked more forlorn than ever. A sad, damp secret amidst the budding morning. Inside, the silence was a physical presence. The air was thick with the memory of panic. The broken lockbox still lay on the floor by the hearth, its contents spilling out like secrets. Kneeling, Elara's hands trembled as she sifted through them again. The photo. The dried flower. And then, tucked into the silk lining of the lid, a compartment she'd missed in her frantic first search. Her fingers brushed against the corner of a thick, crisp piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a document folded tight. The paper was heavy, expensive. At the top, bold black letters made her blood run cold. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as her eyes scanned the dense, legal text. The words were complex, alien, but their meaning slowly, horrifyingly, clarified like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Party A, Alistair Croft, agrees to a one-time payment of $20 million, $20 million, to Party B, Maya Levine, in exchange for full and permanent confidentiality regarding their relationship. Party B agrees to permanently relocate and cease all contact with Party A and his associates. She read on, her breath catching, until she found the clause that shattered her world. Asterisk. Furthermore, Party B agrees to never, under any circumstances, assert, imply, or disclose any claim of paternity for the child, Elara Levine, and shall raise said child with no knowledge of or expectation of support from Party A. The paper fell from her numb fingers. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a contract. She wasn't a daughter. She was a clause. A liability that had been paid off and neatly erased. The money, the house, the silence, the loneliness, it had all been bought and paid for by the man who was now paying for the hospital bed. The man who had looked at her as if she were a stranger because, according to this piece of paper, that's exactly what he had paid her to be. A hot, bitter tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. They were burned away by a sudden, fierce anger. He hadn't just abandoned them. He had deleted them. The sound of a car door slamming outside broke her trance. The driver was waiting. She hastily folded the damning document and shoved it deep into her pocket, the paper feeling like a shard of ice against her leg. She grabbed her mother's shawl as an afterthought, a flimsy prop for her lie. When she returned to the hospital suite, the air was different. Her mother was awake. Maya was propped up on pillows, her face pale but her eyes clear for the first time in days. They flickered around the opulent room, confused and disoriented. Then they landed on Elara, and a weak, relieved smile touched her lips. Elara, where are we? This place. Before Elara could answer, the door to the suite opened. Alistair Croft stood there, having returned to check on his investment. He took a single step into the room. Maya's eyes widened. The color drained from her face, leaving it a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her breath hitched, a sharp, painful sound. Her hand flew out, gripping Elara's wrist with a strength that belied her weakness. You, she gasped, her voice a raw whisper, her gaze locked on the man in the doorway. Get away from us. You signed the papers. The silence that followed was louder than the helicopter, more deafening than the storm. The secret was out. The contract had been breached. The air in the hospital room crackled, thick enough to choke on. Maya's accusation hung between them, a shard of glass suspended in time. Alistair Croft stood frozen in the doorway, his mask of icy composure finally fissuring. For a fleeting second, Elara saw something raw and startled in his eyes. Not guilt, but the shock of a carefully buried past suddenly exhumed. Elara acted before either of them could. She pulled the folded agreement from her pocket, the paper crinkling loudly in the silence. She didn't look at Alistair. Her eyes were locked on her mother. "I found it," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I know what he did." Maya's face crumpled. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. She sank back into the pillows, her hand falling away from Elara's wrist. Alistair recovered quickly. He stepped fully into the room and closed the door with a soft, definitive click. The sound sealed them in together. "Maya," he began, his voice low, attempting to regain control. "The circumstances." "Don't," Maya whispered, her voice ragged. She turned her head away from him, toward Elara, her eyes pleading. "He didn't just leave us, Elara. His family, they made it very clear. I was a distraction. A problem. You were a complication." The story spilled out in halting, painful fragments. A young, vibrant Maya, an artist meeting the ambitious heir Alistair. A whirlwind love affair conducted in secret. When she became pregnant, his family, the formidable Croft dynasty, descended. They didn't threaten violence. They threatened obliteration. They would destroy her reputation, ensure no gallery would ever show her work, and crush Alistair's nascent career if he didn't fall in line. The merger that would solidify the Croft empire was at stake. "The money," Maya said, a bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh. "They called it a settlement. A generous offer to secure our future." He stood there and let them say it. Her gaze flickered to Alistair, full of a pain so old it had fossilized. "He gave me the pen." Alistair stood by the window, his back to them, staring out at the city he owned. "I was 24, he said, his voice hollow, echoing off the glass. "They had me in a vice. I believed. I told myself the money would protect you. That it was better than the war they would have waged against you. Protect us." Elara interjected, the heat of her anger cutting through the clinical air. "You paid us to disappear. You paid to forget I existed." She thrust the document toward him, though his back was turned. "I'm right here." It was then that the door opened again without a knock. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm, assessing gaze that swept the room and immediately understood the emotional detonation that had just occurred. This was Carson, Alistair's head of security. His eyes, the color of flint, lingered on Elara holding the contract on Maya's tear-streaked face. "My apologies for the interruption, Mr. Croft," Carson said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that promised quiet efficiency. "The transfer paperwork for Mrs. Levine's continued convalescence at the Blackwood facility is ready for your review. And the enrollment forms for the girls' new academic institution." He held up a sleek tablet. Elara's blood ran cold. "The girl. Not your daughter. Transfer. New academic institution." The words were benign, but the intent was as clear as the contract in her hand. They were going to be separated. Erased. Alistair finally turned from the window. He looked from Carson's impassive face to Maya's terror, to Elara's defiant, furious one. He seemed trapped between the past he had paid for and the present he could no longer control. Carson took a step closer to Alistair, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but the room was so quiet Elara heard every chilling word. "This is the problem we resolved once before, sir," Carson murmured, his tone devoid of malice, only pure, cold logic. "It's regrettable it has resurfaced. Let me solve it. Permanently this time." The word permanently hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. It wasn't a threat spoken in rage. It was a solution proposed by a businessman. And in that moment, Elara understood the true cost of the Croft family's protection. It wasn't just money. It was their very existence. The silence after Carson's words was a living entity, cold and suffocating. Elara watched Alistair's face, searching for the man from the photograph, for a flicker of the father who might be hidden beneath the billionaire. She saw only a statue, his features carved from ice and indecision, his gaze locked on Carson. This was it. He was going to let it happen. The contract would be enforced. The pen he'd given her mother all those years ago was now signing their final sentence. "No," Elara said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. All eyes turned to her. She wasn't looking at Carson. She was staring directly at Alistair, her small body trembling but her voice steady. "You paid $20 million to forget I existed," she said, the legal phrasing feeling alien and bitter on her tongue. But I do exist. And I remember everything. The leaky roof. The sound of my mother crying at night. I remember being so hungry we split a single can of soup for dinner. Your money did that. It bought us silence and it bought us loneliness. Is that what you want to make permanent? It was a direct hit. Alistair flinched as if struck. The polished facade cracked and for the first time raw, unvarnished emotion broke through. A tidal wave of shame, regret and a dawning, terrifying clarity. He was looking at his daughter, not a clause. He was looking at the consequence of his cowardice, and it had his mother's eyes. Carson sensed the shift. "Sir," he said, his voice hardening, a subtle command. "The car is waiting downstairs. It's time to tidy up." That phrase, tidy up, was the final spark. It reduced Elara and Maya to spilled coffee, to a mess to be cleaned. It reduced his own blood to a problem. Alistair Croft turned. The indecision was gone, replaced by a cold fury that made even Carson take a half step back. "You are relieved of your duties, Carson." Alistair's voice was low, a deadly whisper. "Effective immediately." Carson's composure slipped. "Mr. Croft, be rational. The liability. They are not a liability." Alistair's roar filled the room, shocking in its force. "She is my daughter." He pointed a trembling finger at Maya. "And that is the woman I loved. And you are the man I paid to make them disappear. That ends. Now." A tense, electric standoff followed. Carson's hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward the communication device in his ear. But Alistair was faster. He moved to the hospital room door and yanked it open. Two of his other security personnel loyal to the man, not just the corporation, were stationed outside. "Escort Mr. Carson from the premises. He is to be detained until the authorities arrive. He is to have no contact with anyone." There was a brief physical struggle, but it was over in seconds. Carson, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, was led away, his cold, furious gaze promising this wasn't over. But for now the immediate threat was neutralized. The door closed and the three of them were alone again. The fight had gone out of Maya. She was weeping slow, quiet tears of relief and exhaustion. Elara stood rooted to the spot, her entire body shaking from the adrenaline. Alistair walked slowly to Maya's bedside. He didn't touch her. He just looked at her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, stark and more powerful than any legal document. "I have spent every day of the last 12 years being wrong. The money wasn't protection. It was a cage I built for all of us." He finally turned his gaze to Elara. "I can't undo it. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to earn the right to hear you say my name." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't move to hug her. He simply stood there, emotionally naked and utterly vulnerable, waiting for a verdict he knew he deserved. Elara looked at her mother, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She looked back at the man who was her father. The monster from the contract was gone. In his place was just a man, flawed, broken, and desperately trying to find his way back. She didn't call him Dad. She didn't run into his arms. The wounds were too deep, the history too painful. But she didn't look away. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the city gleaming far below, the contract was finally, irrevocably void. The reckoning was over. The long, difficult work of building something new had just begun. If you enjoyed this chapter and want more breathtaking stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel Philatundra for stories. Your support keeps these stories alive.